Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In my long career, I have scores of times introduced speakers with the stock phrase, "It gives me great pleasure to introduce so and so." Half the time, it actually is not. But today, the only thing I can say is that it gives me genuine pleasure to introduce Professor Happymon Jacob, who I consider to be the leading analyst of India's strategic policy and foreign policy, working out of India. He has written a lot of stuff, both in the newspapers and in academic journals and in books and so on, which have been very perceptive in their analytical clarity. And so, but there's one thing that I wanted to say is that this seems to be, as most analysts would agree, a rather critical phase in Indian foreign policy, because there are lots of problems that have sort of piled up. There are problems with China, obviously, the strategic rivalry, the border problems, but also India's dependence on China for very critical material and consumer goods. And that makes for a very confusing picture. Russia continues to be still, I think, the major supplier of arms to India, and there has been a strategic relationship with Russia that go back decades. And particularly the people of our generation will not forget the Soviet support to New Delhi during the Bangladesh crisis and war, which made a critical difference to the outcome. And obviously, with the United States, India has been deepening both its strategic and economic relationship. The United States is a major, if not the major, market for the export of Indian goods, both consumer goods as well as raw material and so on. But at the same time, under the current administration in Washington, issues of tariff and trade and the sort of rhetoric that is being indulged in has created a lot of doubts in New Delhi about the ongoing relationship and the long-term value of that relationship. So and I'm sure Professor Jacob will expound on it in much greater length. There has been an attempt to reshape, or at least reword or rephrase, Indian foreign policy, with the introduction of the term multi-alignment. As I've told Professor Jacob in one of my emails to him, I think the term multi-alignment is an oxymoron, because alignment is not only alignment includes not only aligning with somebody but also against somebody. So you cannot be aligned with China and against China, with the United States and against the United States, with Russia and against Russia. The problem is that, the problem that inheres in that phrase also demonstrates the dilemma of Indian foreign policy makers. They do not wish to call it non-alignment because it's associated with Jawaharlal Nehru, whom they loathe. So we are witnessing, as I said, a rather critical phase in Indian foreign policy, and I'm sure Professor Jacob will enlighten all of us about the various dilemmas and predicaments that face New Delhi today. Professor Jacob, as I said, is a very eminent strategic analyst, and he's my favorite analyst of Indian foreign policy. He has written in newspapers, in journals, academic journals, as well as published several books. For many years, he was a professor at the prestigious Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, but has recently moved to Shiv Nadar University on the outskirts of Delhi. He's also the founder and director of the Council for Strategic and Defense Research that he set up 5 or 6 years ago. So I invite Professor Jacob to address us. Professor Jacob.
Professor Ayub, ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed an honor and a privilege to be talking to you about India's great power relations today. I'm deeply grateful to Professor Ayub for asking me to give this talk. I have not met you, Professor Ayub, but I have taught your books and articles in my classes at JNU for almost a decade and a half. I must say that your writings have profoundly influenced my thinking about international politics, international relations. I want to specifically mention your work on third world security predicament and your use of historian Charles Tilley to explain state-making processes in the third world. So the more I read you, the more I agree with you. And I wish you had come out with more editions of your work, which you unfortunately haven't. But your first edition will do. We'll continue to teach that. My talk today will primarily focus on the current state of India's relations with great powers. And by great powers, I mean here India's relations with the United States, Russia, and China primarily. I will also bring in EU because it is a major part of global geopolitics today, at least from an Indian point of view, given the nature of the conversations happening between the two sides. My argument is that the return of Donald Trump to the White House earlier this year has fundamentally upset, unsettled, and reshaped India's relationship with great powers. And India has perhaps lost the sweet spot, the geopolitical sweet spot that it enjoyed prior to his second coming. I do admit that it is nothing remarkably sui generis about India as to how Donald Trump has changed the foundations, challenged and changed the foundations of India's great power relations. It's nothing sui generis about India. It's probably the case with pretty much every country in the world today. But the bigger you are, the bigger the consequences for you. I think that's India's predicament today. Trump's reshaping of global geopolitics has been beneficial to some countries, but ruinous for some others. I think India belongs to the latter category. It has been ruinous for India. There is a lack of clarity in Delhi today on how to deal with the current state of affairs, the relationship with the United States. And India does not have too many options as we speak. There is, of course, as I said, lack of clarity. And for a huge country like India, it cannot make decisions and change course and sort of track on a whim. It will have consequences, huge consequences going forward. The bigger you are, the bigger the consequences for you. So let me sort of begin by outlining what I see are some of the assumptions that India held dear before Trump arrived on the scene earlier this year for the second time. India had imagined, and in some ways rightly so, that it would benefit from a great power competition internationally, that it could maneuver between China, Russia, and the United States to its own advantage. As the foreign minister himself wrote in his book, Dr. Jaishankar, that India was keen on exploiting the geopolitical contradictions that existed in the international system. And this ability to exploit those contradictions worked until the very dynamics of that competition changed dramatically. So New Delhi itself, in that sort of pre-Trump age during Biden's period, saw itself as a central player in Asia. It also believed that it was a major power in South Asia and in the Indo-Pacific. I think Trump has come in and disabused India of that notion, the Indian centrality in the region in many ways. Instead of preparing for great power competition, Trump is looking for short-term gains. So if you view the international system through that lens of short-term gains, and if you remove great power, the logic of great power competition from Washington, then Washington has much more to gain from China than it does from India if he's not interested in a great power competition with China. The war in Ukraine, in that prism, through that logic, must end because supporting Ukraine is not worth American taxpayers' money. I spent a week in Ukraine a week ago, and I can tell you that the feeling in Ukraine is definitely one of unhappiness and sadness. And I've been going to Ukraine since 2022, and the mood has changed every year. Now, the Ukrainians understand that Trump is probably not going to support them, and Europe is probably too weak to support Ukraine against a powerful Russia in some ways. So if you look at the changed understanding of the international system in Washington today, Europe's problems with Russia are Europe's problems, not those of the United States. In such a worldview, I think India's geopolitical profile has shrunk invariably. I think that's my primary sort of my takeaway. And I think it is not just the fact that the India-US relationship has changed dramatically and fundamentally. The change in the India-US relationship has major implications and serious implications for India-Pakistan relations, India-South Asia relations, India's positioning in the Indo-Pacific, and India's approach to the Middle East, apart from, of course, India's relationship with the with People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation. Now, these are in some ways the second order implications of the changed context in Washington and the changed relationship between the United States and India. The undoing of India-US relations has thrown up a number of second order implications. And I think the most important implication for India is its relationship, how the relationship with China changes for New Delhi. But before I come to that, let me sort of very quickly also tell you how India viewed the US-China rivalry sitting in Delhi. For India, it wanted a fundamental rivalry between the United States and India, between the United States and China going on in the international system without it becoming a hot war. A hot war would have made or skirmishes in the South China Sea, for example, on the Taiwan question, would have made the Americans ask India to stand by the United States against China, which India would not have wanted to do. And so India preferred neither a hot conflict nor a deep friendship between the United States and China. And because neither of these would have helped India. This was probably the case during the Biden administration, to some extent during the latter years of the Obama administration. But Trump has come in and changed that logic. So when Trump changes the logic of this sort of the Indian desire to have not a hot conflict and not a friendship between the United States and China, it has major implications for India. And I'll come to that in a second. So as far as India-China relations are concerned, what it has done is that it has clearly influenced India's choices towards the People's Republic of China today. You've seen a lot of conversation happening between India and the United States, India and China today. You've seen the Prime Minister visiting Tianjin. You've seen the Foreign Minister and the National Security Advisor going to China, and there's a lot of warmth, as it were, that seems to be growing between the United States between India and China. This, in some ways, is a function of India trying to hedge. Because the United States has, in some ways, conveyed to India that it is no longer interested in that fundamental rivalry with the People's Republic of China. So Trump's indifference to the great power competition with China will have implications for India's relationship with South Asia and India's relationship with Pakistan and India's relationship with the broader concept called the Indo-Pacific. It will mean a free pass when it comes to South Asia. It will mean a free pass for China, which it will attempt to use to tilt the balance of power in its favor in South Asia through a combination of debt trap diplomacy, military agreements, and a series of growing political and diplomatic ties with South Asian countries. India was, as it is, unhappy about the fact that the Chinese have come in and tilted the balance of power in China's favor to India's advantage. Now Trump has come in and has given a free pass to China to do that, to continue to do that. China is going forward more likely to be directly involved in South Asian matters today than ever before, and its defense industry will have a growing role in future military conflicts in the region, as we saw not too long ago in May this year when the India-Pakistan standoff took place. Trump is actually, look at the irony of it, Trump is seeking a trade deal with China while trying to bully India into submission. He shows little interest in the geopolitical fate of the Indo-Pacific in general and South Asia in particular. What about India-Pakistan relations? Under the Biden administration, India was under the impression that India was more important than Pakistan for Washington, D.C. Trump has come in and changed that fundamentally. Today, there is a lot more conversation happening between the United States and Pakistan than between India and the United States. Chinese equipment, on the other hand, has strengthened Pakistan's conventional capabilities and has helped Pakistan in scoring. Let me put it this way. I'll put it very carefully. In doing a very good job in its military confrontation with India in May this year. So it's not just the United States that is improving its relationship with Pakistan. Pakistan is in a position to unabashedly improve its relationship with the United States and reach out to the Middle East, reach out to, as we saw in the case of the UAE-Pakistan defense deal. And there are conversations happening between Russian Federation and Pakistan. The removal of, let's say, the great power rivalry from Washington's calculus has also implications for the Indo-Pacific. I also spent a week in Washington before I went to Kiev. And I'm of the opinion that the United States is probably going slow on the Indo-Pacific. And on the other hand, the Chinese are probably on their good behavior, on their best behavior in the Indo-Pacific. They're reaching out to the Australians. They already have a great relationship with the Indonesians. South Korea is hedging its bets, and India is warming up to China. If India warms up to China, and if the American soft pedal, the Indo-Pacific and Quad, then you're probably looking at the Chinese increasing their own legitimacy in the region over the years. Let me very quickly come to what the decline in the strategic partnership between the United States and India means for India-Russia relationship. I have been arguing for some time that India was on a slow process of divorce from Russia over the last several years. In fact, crudely put, the India-Russia relationship was on life support. Russia tolerated the India slow moving out of the Russian orbit in some ways to the United States, to the Indo-Pacific and the Europeans because Moscow did not have too many options. But with Trump in White House today, Russia has more options and it needs India much less than, say, it needed India last year or 2 years ago when the war started. Moscow today feels a diminishing obligation to New Delhi and is unwilling to offer more support than it receives from India, which in some ways I would say explains the lukewarm backing that India received in May during its own military clash with Pakistan. So I would say that going forward, Russia is likely to prioritize its ties with China and its declining relationship with India. Now, when Moscow prioritizes its ties with China, it would have a third order implication for India-Pakistan relationship because Russia would not want to stand in the way of the relationship between China and Pakistan, and that would mean India will be on the losing side. There was a time when India believed that if there is a conflict between India and Pakistan, the Russians would stand steadily with us. We were disabused of that notion in May this year. Let alone if there is a conflict between India and China tomorrow. There was a feeling, and in 2020, actually, when the India-China standoff took place, Rajnath Singh did go to Moscow, but I assume the conversation was perhaps asking the Russians to get the Chinese to stand down. That is unlikely to happen because Russia is far more powerful today. And the Russians may not want to ask the Chinese to sort of stand down or stand by India in a conflict of that kind. What about India's? Let me talk a little more about the India-Russia relationship. And I think the India-Russia relationship, China-Russia relationship. China-Russia relationship is today strengthened because of the arrival of Donald Trump in the White House. So Ukraine knows that it is probably losing the war in Ukraine. The Russians know that they are probably winning the war there, and this has probably given them a lot more options for Russia to calibrate its great power games. Now, Moscow today wants more partners capable and willing to challenge the United States and Europe in the international order from a structural point of view. What Moscow is not keen is a country that is merely offering its commercial relationship. From an Indian point of view, India offers Moscow with commercial opportunities. It is willing to buy Russian oil. It is willing to buy Russian defense equipment, but India is unwilling to provide Russia with the ability to challenge the United States in the international system or Europeans in the international system, whereas China is willing to do that. So if China is willing to do what it takes to help the Russians to sort of create a counterpole to the US law order in the international system, clearly the Russians would be more interested in that China than this India, which is not willing to sort of stand by Russia. As far as when I said I'll speak about India-EU relations a little bit apart from the relationship that India has with the United States, with China, and with Russia. Although the European Union is not technically a great power, I would say European Union is a major player from an Indian point of view. For India is negotiating an FTA with the European Union. India is of course, talking security and defense with the European Union as an actor and with individual European countries, including the Germans, of course, the French and the others. So there is a lot more conversation today between the EU and India today than ever before in history. They are talking to each other on a variety of issue areas, including on global commons, on multilateralism, on the future of the United Nations, etc. Both are very keen on sort of ensuring that the current order is preserved with some changes, of course. There are, of course, differences between how the Europeans view the current world order and how India views the current world order. But I think the fundamental question today, as I look at Europe, is will the Europeans be able to resist Trump if Trump asks the Europeans to sort of impose sanctions on India for buying Russian oil? And my sense is that the Europeans will find it very difficult to say no to Trump if Trump asks them to sort of impose sanctions on India. Let me now sort of come to a couple of predicaments that I believe that India is faced with today as a function of its troubled relationships with great powers. I think the one major predicament that today India is faced with is the timing of its foreign policy changes. If you look at India's foreign policy in the last 10 years, you will see that there are several fundamental changes that India has undertaken. Number one, India has moved on from its continental obsession to its to the maritime space, which is called the Indo-Pacific. India has moved on from the obsession with Pakistan to focusing on China, balancing China in some ways. India has moved on from Russia to the rest, say the United States or to the European powers and countries like South Korea, Australia, and Japan. And India has also shed its hesitations about FTAs, signing the FTA agreements. When Modi came to power in 2014, he said no more FTAs. In 2021, they revised that policy, and today you're looking at a lot of FTAs that are being pursued. I think all of these are fundamental changes as far as India is concerned. But these changes are happening at a time when there is very little clarity in the international system. And most of these changes were in some ways predicated on the belief that the United States will continue to be a major balancer in the Indo-Pacific region, and the current order is going to prevail for some more time, and you can count on certain pillars of that current order. So India is changing its policy at a time when the international system is changing at a faster pace, which India did not foresee. So where will these changes take India if the system continues to change in an unpredictable manner. I think that's the first major predicament India is faced with today. I think the second predicament is in some ways broadly about the global order. If you were to look at the Indian views on global order, you would sort of characterize India as a status quo plus power. India is not a power that is revisionist. India is not a power that is truly status quoist. A status quo power is probably the United States and the European Union. A revisionist power is perhaps China and some extent, and certainly Russia. India is a power that believes that the current order is fine, but we need to have changes in that. India is a reformist power in that sense. And therefore, India wanted to have certain changes in the current international order, which are of course characterized by Indians' legalization, institutionalization, state centricity, and certain humanitarian logic, and in some ways the US domination of the system. India is not very happy with the system, but it is willing to sort of abide by that with that system with some changes. So I would say what India wanted was not a true democracy in the international system, in running of the international system, but a system in which major powers, based on their ability, based on their material capability, have a say in the running of that system. But we may not necessarily see that system. So India is willing to work with a system, as we saw in G20, in its articulations of the global South, etc. India is willing to improve the current system, but at a time when the United States is saying that I'm not keen on continuing with the system. So I think that is India's second big predicament. I think the third big predicament in some ways is multipolarity, right? I mean, India has been desirous of wanting to have multipolarity. India loves the idea of multipolarity because India has an understanding of multipolarity. But the question today is whether the kind of multipolarity that we are seeing today is an orderly multipolarity or a disorderly multipolarity. I think we are probably looking at a system that is changing in a disorderly manner. For a middle power like India, a middle power, someone call it a major power, someone might want to call it a rising great power. It certainly would like an orderly transition to a new world order, but we may not necessarily see an orderly transition. So the multipolarity that India asked for, India always wanted, in which India would have been a pole, is probably not what we are going to witness going forward. I think that's India's third predicament. I'll end with one last predicament, and that is India missed out the 1945 watershed moment when the post-war order was made. And today India is in a position to sit at the high table and perhaps say, hey, we want to be part of that new order, want to be part of that those countries which would design the next world order. But is that what is going to happen? Are we going to have a more egalitarian, somewhat democratic consensus of or concert of great powers where they sit together and create the new world order? Or are we going to see a Yalta 2.0, in which you will see a G2 or a G3 between the United States and China, the United States and Russian Federation, where they will perhaps decide what the contours of the next world order are going to be. If that's the case, I think India probably miss out again. But the point that I'm trying to make is that India wanted the world order to be designed in a particular way, defined in a particular way, shaped in a particular way, and it has been articulating its ideas of a world order in its articulations at the G20, G7 plus, countries like India, and in its articulations of the Global South Summit, the Voice of the Global South Summit that it sort of hosted in Delhi. But we may not necessarily see that sort of a order making unfolding. We may see something entirely different. So let me end by saying that I think there is a feeling in India that we have to deal with okay, before I come to that, how to deal with, let me put it this way. I think a lot of this is a function of the dysfunctionality in the India-US relationship today. None of this would have happened the way they are panning out today had there been a different president of the United States today. But we have Donald Trump, and he has unleashed a slew of forces that have upset the Indian understanding of how the world order was going to be. So that's one concluding point. The other is that I think the feeling in Delhi is that there is no point in arguing back with the United States and with Donald Trump. So we have to deal with this in an unemotional manner. You go to deal with the United States for what it is, not what you'd like it to be. So I think if that's the case, perhaps we may be looking at the changes in Washington and its consequences for the international system more realistically than sort of let's say emotionally. I'll sort of end here and give the floor back to Professor Ayub.
Hello, I think it's Professor Siddharth Chandran who should take over from now. But I do have a question before I hand over the mic to him. For the last several decades, we have taken it for granted, and you said so yourself, that the United States is the status quo power par excellence. But under the current administration, don't you think it's much more of a revisionist than a status quo power?
Thank you, Professor Ayub, for that question. I totally agree with that. I think the United States is probably its worst revisionist enemy today. There's no reason why the United States should give up so easily a system that it built, a system that it benefits from, a system that its allies benefits from. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that a lot of what's happening is perhaps not a function of a grand strategic, thinking in Washington D.C. Although I must admit that some of the symptoms of the Americans not happy with the system and giving up on that system, the order that they created, were evident even before Donald Trump arrived on the scene. For instance, the manner in which the Americans withdrew from the region, from Afghanistan, from the Middle East, thereby enabling China to have an upper hand in the region, in some ways can only be explained by the fact that there was a feeling within the establishment in Washington D.C. that we need to revise or reshape the contract that we have with the current world order.
Thank you, Professor Ayub, and thank you, Professor Jacob. I'll go straight to the questions. We have two in the question and answer box, so I'll start with those. And then I think there's one in the chat box as well. So the first question is, actually, I think there are a few more questions now. So from Kumar Mayank, Jai Hind, sir. I'm Kumar Mayank, a psychology and economics from University of Calcutta. I believe that examining today's age problem, this is categorically clear that there's something deficient within the body of the Indian external ministry, might be as a consequence of inadequate resources or something else. I'm paraphrasing here, which leads New Delhi to not understand its allies' perspective and priorities. Apart from these systemic vulnerabilities, another drawback, curtailment, I'll let you interpret this question. I'm reading it verbatim. Another drawback, curtailment, New Delhi restricted strength to model and leverage its partners' intentions, preferences, and behavior. Is my opinion reasonable? Today, a handful of Israeli political scientists also say that the Indian external ministry is the weakest ministry in the world. What is your perspective, sir?
Oh, let me put it so. Thank you, Kumar Mayank, for that question. My sense is that it boils down to the capacity issue of the Ministry of External Affairs, and I think The larger point that you're perhaps trying to make is that there aren't enough personnel in the Ministry of External Affairs, and that perhaps leads to a lack of agility, lack of innovation, and lack of imagination by the Indian decision makers. If that's the argument, I think I partly agree with you, and my agreement is where I do agree with you is on the question of the capacity. I think we have perhaps one of the most short-staffed ministries of external affairs in the world. For a country our size, we have under 1,000 diplomats, career diplomats. Of course, there are other folks who come from other departments and work in the ministry for certain time periods. But I've long argued that's probably not enough. You need to staff the Indian foreign ministry with a lot more diplomats. I think that decision perhaps has taken, if not to increase the numbers in radical ways, in modest ways. I think this current batch is about 52 new recruits, which is the highest in the history of the Indian foreign ministry. So I think there is a desire to increase that. But I think the larger point about having more diplomats to sit at the table, to have more negotiations with great powers and international institutions, because it's a fast-moving world. The Indian diplomacy needs to be more agile, creative, and innovative, and for that you need more people. In fact, just last week I wrote a piece in the Hindustan Times where I argued that it is important for India to appoint more special envoys to important capitals and for important issue areas. Say, for example, you need to have a special envoy on new technologies, a special envoy for the Indo-Pacific, a special envoy for the Middle East. A lot happening in the Middle East today, so it's important to have those. The ambassadors have a lot of day-to-day work to do, so they're unable to focus on the larger, bigger issues beyond the point. So I think to that extent I agree with you, but I don't agree. Where I don't agree is that I don't think there is a lack of understanding in the Indian, among the Indian decision makers on what the world is like, what should be India's priorities. I'm sure they have gamed it and they understand it. The understanding is not the issue. I think it's the implementation that's the issue.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Jacob, and thank you for that question. I'm seeing a number of very thoughtful questions here, so this should be interesting. From Professor Satish Udpa, is indifference to what is happening in Washington a winning strategy for India?
No, I don't think. I see the sentiment behind the question, but I'm afraid indifference to the United States is probably not a smart policy choice for India. You go to, I think, learn the art of dealing with a certain individual in Washington, D.C. That's the only way out. I mean, we only have spent about 8 months. We have 3 more years to go. And in those 3 more years, I mean, just look at how Pakistan has managed to deal with a chaotic situation and sort of take advantage of that. So indifference, unhappiness, uneasiness, disappointment, these are not national security strategies. Emotionalism is not a national security strategy, let alone a grand strategy. So you need a grand national security strategy that is sort of created on the basis of an understanding of what Donald Trump wants from India, and those around him. And the structural issues in the India-US relationship. At a certain point of time, the Americans could turn back and ask India, what does India have to offer to the United States? I think that's a fair question. If India believes that the United States must stand by India in XYZ circumstances, which is, say, in the Indo-Pacific, in South Asia, and perhaps even in the Middle East, the Americans have every right to ask the questions of India, that what do you have to offer us? So the question that the Americans will probably ask going forward, and have asked in the past, is that what can you offer us vis-a-vis China? What can you offer vis-a-vis South China Sea contingencies? And I think I'm sure the answers that we gave them are probably not satisfactory to the United States. So I think there are while we deal with Donald Trump and his angularities and his ego, I think there are also fundamental questions that India must answer for itself. Because India is a middle power, perched right in the middle. India is not as weak as the European powers who can bend their knee who should bend their knee before Donald Trump. India is not as strong as China with the leverage to push back against the United States. So India is a typical middle power with neither the humility nor the leverage to push back against the United States. So I think India, therefore, should calibrate its strategy, keeping aside the emotionalism or indifference that we may want to sort of adopt. I don't think that they're going to be helpful.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Jacob. Let's go to the next question from Sanjana Krishnan. Should India wait it out till the end of Trump's presidency, or will it be too late then to have a significant say in the world order?
Absolutely. I think, as I say, there are weeks where decades happen. I think these are months and years where decades are sort of happening. I have no doubt in my mind that in the next 3 years, once these 3 years are over, the world order would have changed fundamentally. The global geopolitics would have changed fundamentally. So as a major power in the region, in Asia, India has no option but to sort of engage these geopolitics as they unfold proactively and creatively. And that includes dealing with Washington, whether you like it or not. And that includes dealing with the Chinese, just as the Indians have started doing. It means perhaps also courting Russia, because just look at India's continental periphery. 15,000 kilometers of unfriendly space, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, to some extent Nepal, Afghanistan. You have no friends there. The only friend India has is the Russian Federation. So India will have to continue to sweet talk the Russians. There's no way out of that. India will have to, of course, reach out to the Koreans and the Japanese in the Indo-Pacific as peer middle powers in some ways. India will have to, of course, work with the Europeans on global commons and multilateralism. So I think this is a period when the traditional Indian reluctance to sort of articulate ideas, articulate policies and positions should be done away with, and India should proactively engage, because by the time we wake up from this nightmare, the world would have changed fundamentally.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Jacob. The next question is from Ayush Kumar Sen. Sir, do you think India's quest for strategic autonomy is becoming harder to sustain with growing dependence on the US for security partnerships?
Okay, let me let me put it that way. Let me put it this way. I think the problem with I'll begin with a different point and come to strategic autonomy. Let's start with the multi-alignment, which Professor Ayub referred to earlier on during his introduction. I think the problem with multi-alignment is that this sounds like a great idea, but how do you practice it? How do you operationalize it? The devil lies in the details. It is a great vision. It's a great great idea. It's good to talk about it, but when everyone is multi-aligned, your multi-alignment counts for nothing. If nobody else is multi-aligned, your multi-alignment counts for something. So before Trump arrived on the scene, the countries were not multi-aligned. Even the United States was not really multi-aligned in that sense of the term. It had certain choices. So India chose to be multi-aligned before Trump arrived on the scene because the world was not multi-aligned. It was loosely or tightly aligned to certain sort of centers of power. But today, pretty much everyone is multi-aligned. Russia is multi-aligned. Pakistan is multi-aligned. The United States is multi-aligned. So India's all multi-alignment doesn't really count for much. So I think there is a problem with our foundational concept of multi-alignment, and that then leads to whether or not you have the ability to align with other powers. If multi-alignment is not an option, then you'll have to pick and choose your battles. You have to pick and choose your partners. And picking and choosing those partners will have consequences, because choices have consequences, right? So I don't want to sort of put my fingers on who exactly India should be choosing as a partner, who India should not be choosing as a partner. But I think the time has come where aligning with everyone and not choosing anybody is probably not a choice any longer. That ship may have sailed already.
Thank you, Professor Jacob. The next question is from Mayank Kumar again. And this is are perceptions of Russian policymakers changing as Moscow feels a diminishing obligation to New Delhi and is less enthusiastic to lend a hand than it receives, which explains its unwillingness during the 4-day Indo-Pakistan clashes.
That's true. As I said in my initial remarks, I agree with the argument that you just made, which is the Russians are perhaps not as enthusiastic about its relationship with India. If I were a Russian sitting in Moscow, I would have pretty much thought of the same. Why should I put so much stress on a relationship with India when India is probably on a weak wicket? The Russians are perhaps telling India what India told Russians earlier, right? I mean, during the Russia-Ukraine war, India played neutral, and India told the Russians that this is not the era of war. And during the India-Pakistan crisis, the Russians pretty much told us the same thing. So I think for Russia today, China is more important, and having a certain rapprochement with the United States is more important, and getting back into the geopolitical scheme of things in Europe is far more important than aligning with India in South Asia or in Central Asia. So Russians, I think, see themselves as a European power, not an Asian power. So their primary zone of contestation or their primary zone of interest, their sphere of influence is Europe in many ways, and not here in Asia. So I think if you go by that logic, India is of secondary importance to Russia today. So I would expect going forward Russians to do for India what Indians will do for Russia. And that's precisely why, and I think the Indians understand that, and that's precisely why India is unwilling to perhaps stop the oil purchases from Russia, not only because of the economics part of it, but also there's a strategic element to it. Unwilling to totally give up on the Russian weapon systems because there's a geopolitical logic to that.
Professor Jacob, I'm going to use the moderator's privilege here and ask you a follow-up question, and maybe a very quick answer you have. Russia has a very big and important Far East as well. And there's always been my sense is some nervousness on Putin's part about the integration of the southern part of the Russian Far East with the Chinese economy. Is that a factor at all in Putin's calculations?
I think so. I think I've been going to Moscow too in the last few years as part of my Russia-Ukraine travels, and my sense is that within the Moscow strategic elite there is an abiding feeling that China is probably not the best friend that Russia will have in the longer run. After all, China is doing to Russia economically what NATO, in their understanding, is doing to Russia militarily. So Far East has been one of their soft underbellies in some ways, and that's why the Russians had invited India and countries like Japan and South Korea to come and invest in sort of Russia's Far East. The Chennai Vladivostok corridor, and a lot of those conversations are happening. But I think once the war sort of started, the Russians and the South Koreans have withdrawn. Even the Indian sort of focus on the region has sort of come down. So I think that's going to be a weak point for the Russians going forward.
Okay, thank you. Professor Udpaz posted an extended version of his original question. So I'll start with the original. Is indifference to what is happening in Washington a winning strategy for India? In other words, should we not react to every pronouncement that comes from DC?
No, I don't think responding to every pronouncement that comes from Peter Navarro or Donald Trump are useful at all. Silence is probably the best policy. Back channel diplomacy is the best policy. Trump understands the art of the deal, right? So see what deal that India can give to Trump. I understand the as a major country in the region, 1.45 billion people. There's a certain national pride that comes with it. But I think you are in difficult circumstances. So I think talking back, responding likewise, or sort of retaliating are not the policies to be followed. Talking to a lot of people in DC in the last few weeks, my sense is that India has to find something that Trump can agree to. I think the good news, of course, is that Trump hasn't said anything personally about Prime Minister Modi. If anything, the two gentlemen have only traded good words about each other. I think that's a positive sign. It's also possible that Trump is escalating to de-escalate. So when somebody is escalating, you don't escalate. It's a much bigger power that is escalating. So you sort of try and de-escalate. That's what you should. So I think response is probably not likewise is not a good idea.
Okay. Thank you for that answer, Professor Jacob. So from Ayush Kumar Sen, sir, we increasingly see religion resurfacing as a factor in global politics, from Middle East conflicts to identity-driven politics in South Asia. How significant do you think this trend is for international security and diplomacy in the coming decades?
That's way out of my league, but I'd probably request the chair and Professor Ayub to sort of dwell upon that a bit going forward. But I definitely would say this, that like any form of identity, be it nationalism, be it subnationalism, be it regionalism, religion too is a major marker in contemporary international politics, in contemporary geopolitics. So this is something that's going to have a lot more ballast in world politics going for this, not getting away from that. But this is only one of the factors. It's not the decisive factor that will shape or reshape international politics.
Thank you, Professor Jacob. Professor Ayub, as sort of an internationally known scholar on these issues, having studied not just India, of course, but also the Middle East in great detail and written a number of fantastic books, would you like to chime in on this point?
No, I think let us keep it as
Okay.
Professor Jacob's show. I do have a few questions if you give me a few minutes at the end.
Absolutely. I see your message. So the next question is from Sanjana Krishnan. In the current disorderly world order, can India benefit by concentrating on becoming a leader in solving emerging threats and becoming a security provider in those areas to other states, especially the states from the global south?
Let me sort of answer that in two or three parts. I certainly believe that middle powers have a role today to begin a conversation about the contours of the new world order. They have a responsibility to cater to global commons and global public goods. They have a responsibility to hold forth certain responsible conversations when irresponsibility is ruling the roost in Washington, D.C. So definitely, India must have those conversations with Indonesia or South Korea or the European Union or Canada. Definitely, those conversations must be had. When it comes to the global South, the whole global South argument is more fire and fury than substance. Let's be honest about it. Does India see itself as a global South power, or does India see itself as a global power? The latter, I would assume, not the former. Is India going to? Does India want to be the sort of a leader of the global South, or does India want a table at the high table of international politics, which is the United Nations Security Council? The latter, I would say so. Is India passionate? Is India a passionate advocate of the global South issues and the third world issues as it used to be during the heydays of the G77 or the NAM or the various other such movements as it is today? India is probably today talking about some of those issue areas because that's a good audience to talk to some of these geopolitical concerns. You need the support of the global South to make your arguments in G20 and G7, but I'm not so sure those are really the arguments that are driving contemporary Indian foreign policy. To the extent that there's an overlap between the concerns of the global South and the interests of the Indian state, of course, they must be pursued and they must be talked about. But to sort of be a security provider to the global South or countries in the region, or to be a leader of the global South, I don't think that's where India's destiny is. I don't think that's how the Indian decision makers or politicians view India's eventual destiny as.
Okay, thank you. A question from Mayank Kumar. Do these diplomatic setbacks also unveil that unlike Jewish Americans, Indian Americans or the Indian diaspora expatriates have failed to assert a meaningful presence and leverage, including influence on the international stage?
Once again, I think I'll request the two of you to chime in on that, but my own limited understanding of, I haven't done much work on the Indian diaspora in the United States, but I believe this is perhaps a question of capacity, right? I mean, there is no comparison between the Jewish lobby in the United States. I mean, as Stephen Walt and Meir Shamer have written this excellent book about the Jewish lobby in the United States, the power they have is unparalleled. So I don't think the comparison between the ability of the Israeli state to let's say influence American policy towards Israel and the Indian ability to use the Indian diaspora in the United States to influence the American policy towards India are comparable. The Jewish lobby is far older, far richer, far stronger, and far more embedded than the Indian diaspora in the United States. So I think the Indian diaspora itself is probably under fire today. Its ability to continue to work in the United States under H-1B visa, using H-1B visas, etc. So I think they first have to, let's say, establish a foothold to be able to influence Washington's policy towards India.
So Professor Jacob, there's a question from Beena Patel in the chat box, and I was initially going to say this is about visas and impacts on the university. And I was going to say maybe this is not closely related to what we're talking about, but I think the first part may be, especially in light of what you said. So it's a very general question. Hello, what are your thoughts on the H-1B visa? And then the rest relates to, students being on F-1 visas and impacts on universities, which I leave out. But I think the first question can also be interpreted in a geopolitical light. So do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, very quickly, I will say, because it's specifically on H-1B visa, I assume I understand that this is a conversation that is happening between Washington and Delhi at this point of time. But let me also put it this way: apart from the fact that the Indians tech workers in the United States sending remittances to India, this is not a concern that is widely felt within the Indian body politic, right? I mean, this is not something that keeps the Indian policymakers awake at night. I think there are bigger fishes to fry, but this certainly is a concern. But this is a limited concern. This is a narrow concern. This is not a concern that is of great consequence to India, apart from the fact that this helps in terms of remittances and others. In fact, if the conversation that's happening in India is also about the H-1B visa is actually about brain drain. So if there is an imposition of $100,000 on the visa seekers, it's going to be brain gain for India. Whether or not that is a valid argument, that is the kind of I think narrative that's happening in India. I just want to sort of tell you where the debate is, and this is probably not right on top of the Indian priorities at this point.
Okay, thank you. Question from Mayank Kumar. In your Hindustan, I'm assuming Hindustan Times column, India-Japan ties need a big leap in the Indo-Pacific. You mentioned that if the US maintains a strong military commitment to the region and effectively deters Chinese aggression, Japan might have less incentive to strengthen its ties with India. Could you please clarify and justify your statement?
Right. My argument essentially is that if I were to sort of remove the United States from, hypothetically speaking, from the Indo-Pacific, who is that one power that is probably most consequential for India in the Indo-Pacific? I think that one power that is most consequential for India outside of the United States in the Indo-Pacific is Japan. Now, Japan, of course, um, 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 uh, is 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 moving towards India in the Indo-Pacific, in the region, because the Japanese understand that the Americans are perhaps losing their interest in the Indo-Pacific. The American decisions about reaching out to China or commitments to its allies in Europe and in Asia will have implications for Japanese own strategy and security in the region. So if that logic is valid, then if there is a solid commitment from the United States, military commitment from the United States to the Indo-Pacific and to East China, to East Asia, then there would be less incentive for Tokyo to strengthen its partnership with India. In the absence of that, Tokyo feels the need to strengthen its partnership with India. In fact, there is also the strengthening of their partnership, or let's say forgetting old rivalries with Seoul, reaching out to let's say Australia, etc. So I think it's a question of choices, right? I mean, if you have the Americans there, there's less need for Tokyo to reach out to countries like India. So in the absence of that, they'll want to do that. That's my argument in the Hindustan Times column.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Okay, Professor Ayub, you said you'd like to ask a couple of questions at the end. I have one question too. Would you like to ask them after mine or before?
Yes, it's after yours.
Okay, so Professor Jacob, over here in the US, the way higher education serves as a pipeline into the foreign policy establishment is we have universities, we offer majors, programs for intensive language learning along with area studies coursework, and then students are recruited into the foreign service. There is a foreign service exam, but the structure is very, very different from the structure of the Indian system. Can you tell us, and by the way, the US Department of Education just canceled the program that serves as a pipeline. They had a fellowship program and a program of national resource centers, whereby they fund these centers in different universities as centers of excellence in area studies, right? So, Russian and Eurasian studies or Latin American and Caribbean studies. How do things work in India, and how do you see the higher education system interfacing with India's capability to do diplomacy and ultimately to perhaps help solve some of these many, many problems that you've laid out that India faces?
Okay, several ways of looking at it. First of all, unlike in the United States or in other places, the Indian Foreign Service is not a standalone sort of recruitment, as it were. You sort of apply for the Indian Civil Service, the Civil Service examination, and then some of the top rankers get into the Indian Foreign Service. So they may not have necessarily wanted to join the Foreign Service, but they end up in the Foreign Service because they have a certain ranking, etc. They might have wanted to join the Indian Police Service, but they might end up, or Administrative Service, but they might end up in the Foreign Service. But that's a side argument. The way I look at India's ability to have a mark on global geopolitics or international order that unfolds as it does now is not really dependent on the ideas that exist in India or in Indian Foreign Service about what we must do, what must be India's view of the world, what must be India's vision for the new world order, etc. I think some of those visions and articulations do exist already. In fact, a country like India has far too many articulations and far too many visions. So it's not a poverty of ideas. I think that's a problem here. I think the problem for India today is to sort of have the leverage in material terms to be able to shape the international order to its liking to some extent. I think where India is found wanting today is precisely in that leverage. It's not as if the People's Republic of China, the Chinese universities or Chinese think tanks articulate their foreign policy vision, pretty much every day. They don't. It's a party state, and the state controls that narrative. But China is able to shape the international order, international system today in significant ways because of its material capability. It has the leverage. It has the GDP. It's a $20 trillion economy. It has a huge military, cyber capability. So that ultimately has implications for foreign policy. So I wouldn't be too worried about the education system or the ideas produced by that education system on foreign policy. I would be more worried about what is my GDP? Is my GDP going to be $5 trillion, or is my GDP going to be $10 trillion? $10 trillion. If it is a $10 trillion economy, my ability to influence the global order is significant. If it is going to be $5 trillion economy for the next 5 years, how many, howsoever great ideas I might have, my ability is going to be somewhat limited.
Okay. Thank you. We actually have one more question that popped up that is exactly on the lines of what you just said. Withdrawal of the United States under Donald Trump from the WHO and UNESCO is likely to embolden China to foster its influence in the realms of education, health, science, technology, and heritage in global politics. So I think this is a question. So therefore, is there no replacement of the US except China, no substitute in the world order?
No, I think that's a very valid question. I would sort of also include the various assistance programs that the United States used to conduct in Africa, in Asia, and in South America. One of the ways in which the United States used to push back the Chinese debt trap diplomacy in South Asia was by providing various kinds of assistance to smaller countries in the region. Now, if the United States has withdrawn from many of those activities, China is stepping in. China will continue to step in. I think one of the alternatives is for countries like India, Japan, Germany, South Korea, Australia, etc., to get into what is called trilateral cooperation. And there is a lot of trilateral cooperation happening, say, for example, between Germany and India, in Africa, in South Asia, in the Indo-Pacific. There's also a lot going on in the trilateral sphere between India and Japan with third countries in the region. So I think the more the Americans withdraw and the more Chinese come in, it becomes imperative for countries like India, Japan, and others to sort of occupy that space. And I think a lot of that is already happening. It is not as if that's not happening, but I think India also must. It is also important for India to sort of shed its own traditional feeling of having that primacy in South Asia, and that we will manage South Asian affairs on our own. It's important for India to bring in other countries. Say, for example, something goes wrong, as it did a few years ago in Sri Lanka. Why should India spend $2 billion there in Sri Lanka? Why shouldn't it ask, say, Japan or South Korea or others to sort of chip in and sort of jointly, go help the Sri Lankans? So I think that has to happen in some of the other South Asian countries as well. You can't do it alone.
Thank you, Professor Jacob. So we have about 20 minutes left, which I think is the right amount of time to hand the mic back to Professor Ayub. You said you had a couple of concluding questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Siddharth Chandra. Yeah, I won't take 20 minutes. It'll probably be just a minute or two. I have two questions that I wanted to pose to you, very short questions. And the third one just popped up in my mind after what Professor Siddharth Chandra mentioned about higher education. So I'll put those three questions, and I hope you'll be able to answer them. The first one is, and you referred to this in passing, about the conversations that have been taking place or attempting to, between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. But I'm still wondering what has happened to the much touted personal chemistry between Modi and Trump. The second question I have is, why is Indian neighborhood policy in shambles? whether you look at Nepal, Bangladesh, of course, Pakistan is a different issue altogether, but there is a feeling that Indian policy towards its neighbors is really in trouble. And is it connect? It's probably connected both to the domestic politics in India as well as into the neighboring countries. But I'd like you to expand on that. And the third one, which relates to higher education, is don't you think that the higher education system in India in deep trouble because of political interference and the attempt to ideologically infiltrate the entire educational process?
Let me begin with the first one. On the Trump Modi chemistry, as it were. I think the chemistry was quite palpable and evident, and it lasted as much as long as it lasted, which is perhaps through the first tenure of Donald Trump in the White House. We haven't seen that chemistry after Trump occupied office for the second time earlier this year. But in any case, there was no bad blood between the two prime ministers. So I believe that in the wake of the India-Pakistan standoff in June this year, that chemistry should have been used more innovatively and creatively. And unfortunately, I am of the opinion that in May this year, the Pakistanis were more agile in their outreach to Washington and utilizing all resources that they have than the Indian side. Indian side played by a familiar playbook. And that playbook was that the Americans will mediate in an India-Pakistan crisis, but will not take any credit for that mediation. So we played by a familiar playbook that didn't cut much ice with Donald Trump. Donald Trump wanted the personal appreciation and personal calls and personal glory for that. I think India should have perhaps utilized that need of the person occupying the White House and perhaps gotten Mr. Modi to utilize the chemistry that existed between the two sides. Now, once the developments sort of unfolded as they did after the May crisis, things have, the train has left the station. The chemistry train has left the station, unfortunately. In fact, that has derailed. Some of that exists today. As I said, they haven't called each other names, and therefore there is still a possibility as and when that chemistry needs to be brought back into play. That possibility does exist. But that alone will not be able to bring the relationship back on track. You will need a lot more. That probably was enough earlier. That isn't probably enough at this point of time. You need a lot more on the plate than the chemistry. So I think the two sides are figuring out what are those things that you need on the plate apart from chemistry. The chemistry is perhaps going to be the icing on the cake, not the cake itself. Let me sort of come to your second question about India and South Asia. I think India's you paraphrased it as India's neighborhood policy is in shambles. Yes, I think India's relationship with its neighborhood is in bad shape. Let me put it that way. I think that's a function of several factors. Factor number one, you have say in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, when China was still building its empire of influence in Southeast Asia. The South Asia was pretty much given to India on a platter. India enjoyed unparalleled primacy in the region. India saw itself as the primary power for a very long time, and the Indians sort of, let's say, call it managed, shaped, interfered South Asian affairs in the manner they sort of deemed fit. But today, China has come to South Asia, and China is telling India, South Asia is my neighborhood too, geographically and otherwise. So China has come in and upset and tilted the balance of power totally in its favor. And if I were a small South Asian country sitting in South Asia, in Kathmandu or in Dhaka or in or in Colombo, I would say to myself, why should I be only being nice to the Indians? I should also reach out to the Chinese because they have a lot of money. They're able to do things that the Indians are unable to do, and they have they have no, let's say, Raj hangover in South Asia. The Indians probably have a Raj hangover, British Raj hangover in South Asia, which the Chinese don't have. So the Chinese have come in, they have been received by South Asian powers, and they have tilted the balance of power. So that's, I think, point number one. The second point, in some ways, is that South Asia is also changing. Today, South Asia is not the South Asia of, say, 2000s or 1990s. The South Asia of 1990s and 2000s needed India, wanted India, welcomed India. In fact, welcomed India to intervene and interfere. Nepalese did that. The Maldives did that. Sri Lankans did that. So India. So that time is gone. There are democratic aspirations in those countries. You've seen how youngsters, Gen Zs, changing the domestic politics in many of these countries. So India cannot continue with the policy that it continued in those countries for a long time. It has to reinvent its primacy in South Asia. And how it does that is a matter of, I think, policy making. I don't have any answers to that. But let me also add to what I said by saying that I think it was perhaps a mistake from the Indian side to abandon SARC in some ways. I mean, SARC is one major India-centric organization in the region. Today, SARC is abandoned for the last 10 years, going to be 11 soon. We haven't had a summit meeting of the SARC, so which means that one India-dominated or let's say India-centric organization in the region is defunct. Today, pretty much all countries, apart from outside of, say, Bangladesh and Bhutan, are part of the SCO, which is a China-centric organization. Bangladesh is asking for membership. It might actually get a membership. Every other country is either a member or a dialogue partner or an observer at SCO. But let me also make a final point on India's relationship with South Asia. I'm of the opinion that South Asia has held India back for the longest period. South Asia has held India back for the longest period because India behaved like a South Asian power. India was boxed in a competition with Pakistan. India was not focusing on China. India was not focusing on the Indo-Pacific because we are so obsessed with our land frontiers and our continental space that we gave up on them. For a land-faring nation with a history of seafaring nation, we gave up on our seafaring traditions totally after 1947. And therefore, in a grand strategic sense of the term, India's neighborhood is not just South Asia. India's neighborhood is also the Indian Ocean region. India's neighborhood is also the Middle East. So India has to sort of expand the idea of neighborhood in some ways. So therefore, when you sort of try and expand your idea of neighborhood, when you try and expand your grand strategy to involve the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East and other far-flung regions, when you start emerging as a major power in the international system, there will be consequences, there will be costs that will have to be paid in the neighborhood. I think we are also probably seeing some of that in South Asia. And of course, China is ready to take over that vacuum that India's own other priorities keeps India busy with.
What about the higher education issue?
Sorry, the higher education. Certainly, I mean, I don't disagree with the fact that there is a certain politicization of higher education institutions in India. For that matter, there was politicization of higher education institutions in India at all points of time. The left parties used to dominate the intellectual environment in Indian universities for a long time. The Congress party did the appointments of the vice chancellors when it was in power, and it let the left of center intellectuals have a strong say in the Indian universities. Today, the right-wing parties are in power. They think that for the longest period, the leftists and the Congress had a free run in the Indian universities. Now their time has come. Now I'm of the opinion that has made a negatively qualitative change to Indian higher education system. I don't deny that at all. The standards in Indian universities have come down. But on politicization itself, this has already existed. But the standards have come down. Yes, the standards have come down. And I think the winner is private universities in India. Now the losers are the people who are unable to pay high fees to study in Indian private universities. They would go to the public universities and used to get a world-class education. They can still go to public universities, but may not get a world-class education. So there is that problem.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Jacob. Ayub, do you have any
No,
follow-up comments?
No, I just wanted to thank him, thank Professor Jacob for that, the profound address that he gave us.
Thank you. We do have 8 minutes. Can I ask you another question?
Sure.
You mentioned something about India. It's becoming harder and harder for India to kind of balance and stay in the middle, right, of all of these developments. And it kind of reminded me of my childhood, right, growing up in India during the Cold War, where India faced a similar kind of dilemma, ended up being non-aligned, but much closer to the Soviet Union than it was to the United States. If the world is in fact headed in that direction, which way should India go? Which way do you see India going?
Let me put my own view on that is the following. During the Cold War years, India was a much weaker power. It started out as a much impoverished country. Its GDP was nowhere on the scene. Militarily, we were weak. We were defeated by the Chinese. And there was a Cold War competition between two superpowers. It made perfect sense for India to have that Cold War competition and make use of that Cold War competition to its advantage. You are not a major power. There are two powers who are willing to court you. So you try and reach out to both and gain what you can from both the sides. That worked for India. Today, if the world is moving towards a bipolar competition between the Chinese and the Americans, that doesn't suit India, because India of 2025 or India's 2026 is not the India of 1970 or 1960. India is a much bigger power today. India is unwilling to fall in line with either of the two great powers, two superpowers or two superpower blocks. India is also not willing to be in a position to align with two sides and sort of say that we accept a bipolar world. India wants to be a pole. India sees itself as a $5 trillion economy, as a nuclear weapon state and a major power. India says we have every right to be a pole on our own. So you cannot be a pole of your own if you have a tight bipolar competition and if you are caught between these two. Your ability to be a pole of your own increases in a multipolar world if there is no tight bipolar competition. So a G2 or a G3 reduces that. But that tight bipolar competition was all right for India during the Cold War years, because India is a weaker power. We have modest expectations of ourselves and modest aspirations. We had the aspirations. We can have the aspirations, but you didn't have the material power to sort of back it up. Today, we have more material power. We have more aspirations. We have more material power to back up our aspirations. And yet, we are unable to emerge as a pole because of today there is an uncertainty. You don't know if it's a bipolar world. Is it going to be a bipolar world? Whether you're going to be caught between these two guys, whether you'll be able to exploit the contradictions between these two sides and sort of create certain value for yourself. You don't know where you are headed. But until things crystallize, I think what India wanted to have, as I said in the beginning, was a modest competition between the United States and the People's Republic of China, which does not lead to a hot war or a hot competition, which does not lead to an accommodation between the two sides. So that was a healthy balance India aspired, because in a healthy balance of that kind, the United States will want India to be a power in the region that can moderate the rise of China, that can moderate the Chinese power. Now, Indians would sort of, let's say, fan the American fantasies of being the power in Asia that could moderate the American power without actually doing so. You don't have that option anymore. Trump has come in and called the Indian bluff in some ways. Let me put it that way, because Trump is saying, I don't need you. I don't need you to moderate the Chinese power. I will deal with the Chinese myself. And therefore, your ability to be a major important geopolitical actor in the region is unimportant, irrelevant to me. What do you have to give me on trade, on various other issues? That's what I'm after.
Mm.
So I'll end by saying, therefore, that what sort of works best for India is to be a pole in a multipolar world. But that multipolarity ain't coming. It doesn't seem to be coming. And that's where I think the problems are. Because we are not mentally prepared to be caught in a Cold War like the Cold War years. We're preparing ourselves for something else, and that doesn't seem to be coming.
We have 2 new questions in the box, but 3 minutes to go. Ayub and Professor Jacob, what do you think? Should we entertain them?
Yeah,
I also think that,
All right.
Professor, you speak a little more about some of the questions.
No. Some other time.
Okay.
All right.
We do have 2 more questions, and let's try to do them as quickly as we can. And I'm going to make these the last to everybody in the room because we're coming up on 10:30. So Kumar Mayank, sorry. My last question, how much will the Pakistan-Saudi Arabia military pact impact India?
My sense about the Pakistan-Saudi Arabia pact is that this is not going to be of any material consequence to India. I don't think this will have a military material consequence to India's national security in the region. Having said that, there is a difference between being secure and feeling secure, right? I mean, so as far as the being secure part is concerned, this is not going to make much of a material difference. But it contributes to the general sense of angst in Delhi in some ways, because you're looking around and what are you seeing? You're seeing unpredictable Americans. You're seeing China encroaching on your traditional sphere of influence in South Asia. Indo-Pacific and Quad taking a backseat. You're looking at the Russians hedging towards India. You're looking at Pakistanis reaching out to Americans, reaching out to the Russians, reaching out to the Middle East. So all around you, major geopolitical developments are taking place which are not in your favor. Add to that, you have the Saudi Arabia Pakistan deal. It contributes to the angst, it contributes to the feeling of insecurity, but it doesn't contribute to you being insecure. So that's the distinction I would make, and that's my answer to that.
Thank you. So last question from Ayush Kumar Sen. Sir, with SAARC largely defunct due to the India-Pakistan tensions, do you think India should seek to reimagine SAARC in a new form, perhaps excluding Pakistan, or should it continue focusing on alternative platforms like BIMSTEC?
I think if you were to ask me this question about a year ago, I would have said that SAARC is dead, SAARC is defunct, move on. But I think things have changed, geopolitics has changed, the world has changed. I think it's time to sort of resurrect SAARC. It is also time to have a back channel conversation with Pakistan. It is time to sort of our policy of having a South Asia minus Pakistan hasn't really succeeded. I think it's good to be honest about that. So I think we should sort of go back to the drawing board and see how we can work with Pakistan, how we can reimagine SAARC. Because remember, there's already a conversation going on in certain capitals in South Asia, how there can be a SAARC minus India. So I think we are in strange sort of times, and the strange times require, I think, agile and innovative thinking.
Thank you, Professor Jacob. We're at 10:30 exactly. So on behalf of all of us at Michigan State University, the Asian Studies Center, International Studies and Programs, I don't know if you have other representation apart from Professor Ayub and me, but James Madison College as well. Thank you so much for taking the time. I think it's evening over there, probably dinner time. Thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts with us on a very, very complicated situation in a very complicated world, if I may add. And thank you so much, Professor Ayub, for suggesting this talk and also for introducing Professor Jacob this morning.
It was
We
my
hope you'll all stay in touch. Go ahead, Professor Ayub.
I'm saying it is my pleasure actually to finally see, even if by Zoom, Professor Jacob, because I've been reading him for a long, long time, and he is obviously just he's a brilliant scholar, and as I said earlier in my introduction, the leading analyst of strategic affairs as far as Indian policy is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ayub. Kind words. Likewise, I've been teaching your material to my students, so it's a great honor to finally meet you,
Thanks,
even if via Zoom. And thank you, Professor Chandra, for organizing this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.